In this episode, Jahed and I connected with Tamara Helenius, who is a current investor with Demeter Road and a program manager at the Common Stack. In an earlier episode, we spoke with Jeff Emmett at the Common Stack about token engineering. In this episode, we discussed the human side of building ecosystems, commons, and companies that embrace decentralization. It builds on the conversation we had with Richard Bartlett on the human work of how to create culture and how technology can support this work rather than undermine or replace it. Anyone working on thinking through how to pragmatically decentralize a part or an entire company or build for the commons will be interested in this episode.
All right, Tamara, thanks for joining us today. We usually like to kick this thing off by getting to know you a little bit before we get into the details of DAOs, Web3, and all the various jargon that pops up. So maybe you could start by telling us a bit about yourself as a human. Who is Tamara? Where did you come from, etc.?
Oh, that's such an easy question to answer. I'm so glad you asked. Well, I guess in relation to where we are now, there's maybe some key things to that I look back that made a lot of impact to me being where I am now and having the interests that I do now. So I, I'd say when I was in university, I didn't really know what I was looking for. I was an art student and studied Russian literature and Baroque Italian art and all kinds of things until I took my first computer science class. And then I dropped everything. And it was just math and computer science from there.
Nice.
And so, it was nice, but I ended up leaving. I was hired out of college by a former Harvard professor who started a digital agency in New York City, where I grew up. And so, I started as a systems administrator and then systems architecture for a number of digital agencies. And I think that this is probably the most important, even though it ages me, because those of us who were very deeply involved in the digitization of information, going from no web to web, have a particular vantage point of this new digitization of value, going from Web 2 to Web 3. So I think a lot of those experiences inform my own perspective about where we are and where we're going, and where, the dystopian or utopian paths we can take. And I worked in a number of different companies. I sort of moved out of the technical hands-on and into project management, team management, and worked at a number of different organizations. I really liked, the nerd in me is drawn to organizations and how humans cooperate and how we can be more effective. So I worked at a number of different organizations because I liked seeing how things happened on the inside. This startup company was called Spiral Media. It was eventually acquired by agency.com. I worked at Google. I've worked at Jim Cramer's company, the street.com, which is a financial
I noticed that. That was awesome. I was like, the street, that's awesome.
The first pop up.
Yes. It was a lot of fun. It was a great time. Side note, but Jim Cramer's a very rational, calm person. And when he's in a meeting room, he's not Mad Money in the office. And then when I moved to France, I chose to work as a managing consultant, specifically because I wanted to go into many different organizations and see how they work and try to solve organizational problems. So I think that's the other thing that really brings me to where I am today. I really like organizational development and design and understanding cooperation, and where the things that I'm learning about now weren't on my radar. The ability for decentralized organizations just didn't really seem feasible or rational or reasonable, like they are clearly proving to be now.
Cool. So I think that's a really interesting inroad, because the little pocket of Web3 that you operate in with, there's the Giveth, TEC, Common Stack. We'll get into all those terms later. Some of them should be familiar to previous listeners of the pod, but basically, when you speak to cooperation, organizational structure, different ways of organizing ourselves at work and in other places, how did you encounter some of these ideas, right? I'm specifically speaking to stuff around public goods, commoning, Ostrom, all that. Her work carries she has quite a bit of influence in the space. And it was a surprise to me coming to it a few years ago, because I encountered this stuff from a completely different intellectual tradition. So it's always, interesting for me to learn what captured your attention there? How did she get on your radar, and how did others get on your radar?
To answer that, I kind of probably have to say how I even got into Web3, because she came on my radar through the organization I'm working with, Common Stack, the organization I'm working with now. Prior to my experience with Common Stack, I understood the conventional wisdom of the tragedy of the commons. And I probably bought into that paradigm. So, I didn't really understand the possibilities of Bitcoin, crypto, blockchain, as it's called, until in late 2016, I saw Dan Tapscott's TED Talk, and it was just disintermediation. And I was like, that's everything. That changes everything. And that talk, I don't remember what it was called. I just remember disintermediation was that secret aha moment that threw me back, decades to when I realized how important the web was going to be. And it was like, oh, this is the only thing I'm going to spend my life on now. And at that time, I guess like many other people were very skeptical and didn't understand how any of it worked. There was a really good Coursera course. It was called like Understanding Bitcoin or something like that. It was like a Yale course very early on. That was great. That helped with the technical aspects of it. And then there's like a lot of speculation and trying to understand. There's like the ICO craze. And I was like, I don't understand any of this, but I'm really trying to understand it. And I felt locked out of some of the, people were doing things with DAOs, even at that time, like the DAO. And I didn't know how to participate there because I thought I wasn't, I was like, I'm not really going to go become a programmer. Like, I'm not going to. So a few years fast forward to 2020, I really had been, at this point, I'm convinced and I'm all in. And I think I really wanted to work with people that were going to change the world in a meaningful way. And that's all I want to do. I want to work with people that are going to change the world. And I came across Common Stack and I wrote to them, and I had my first interview with Griff Green, and then later met Jeff Emmett, of course, who's also on this podcast, who's extraordinary. I consider it's a privilege to be able to work with both of them, and Livia and Ivy and Jessica and the other people who were at Common Stack at the time. And he was just like, oh, okay, we have a call tonight. Can you join us at 5? Just like, it was just so clear to both of us that it was like, all right, this is the right match. Like, there's an organization that can use my skills, and there's me that needs this organization because I love what they're doing. And I think that this is going to change things. And this is where I first came across Elinor Ostrom. And part of my, onboarding was learning about what Commons is and what it isn't. And so, I guess I'm not so surprised to see how pervasive Elinor Ostrom is. I guess what maybe surprised me more was that her work is so recent, right? She won the Nobel Prize in 2009, I think. So not too long ago. And the most amazing thing is she won the Nobel Prize for basically saying humans can cooperate. And it was such a radical idea that they gave her a Nobel Prize. They're like, humans can cooperate without market or state. Oh my God, give this woman a Nobel Prize. Like, this is, and it seemed so, it seemed like conventional wisdom was leading in the opposite direction. That, of course, I think it's Scott Hardin's theory about
Garrett Hardin. Yes.
Oh, Garrett Hardin, yeah.
Yep.
The tragedy of the commons was so obvious that it became conventional. And he wasn't wrong. He just wrong about describing what a commons was. It was the tragedy of the free-for-all. But he didn't really take the time to understand what a commons was. And Elinor Ostrom, having done that work and producing these principles that she observed. So it's basically empirical data that we can now apply. Even though it's not prescriptive, we can try to apply it into a cultural build. And this is what Common Stack is doing, creating this cultural build based on the 8 principles of Elinor Ostrom, so that the community who is managing these commons, these public goods that we hope to change the world by making more prevalent and important, have a better chance at sustainability. Many organizations in the Web3 space and outside the Web3 space maybe disregard the importance of culture in the ability to sustain the organization. And I think we feel that the culture is like the cornerstone, like culture first. The technology layers, the technology stacks assist the culture. It's not the culture that assists the technology stacks.
Definitely. So I think then, since you ended up at Common Stack anyway, let's just dig into that a bit. We spoke with Jeff, at length about it. We didn't really touch on it too much. So I'd love to know a bit more. If you could tell us in a sentence, what is the goal of the Common Stack?
We want to see these communities have microeconomies that support an economy that is their economy that supports a public good. So what we've built is, or like conceived and built, we do research and we do product and development and we do services. Now we're just starting to do like these commons services for other communities that want to adapt some of the tools that we've built and deploy some of the protocols that we've created. I'd say that this, going back to this culture first, organizations, especially in Web3, right? Like decentralization, no leadership, there's friction and there's a conflict and there's no way to manage it. And many of these communities just, because it's the culture that fails. They may have very large treasuries, just impeccable technology stacks. The cultural element is like the weakest link in the chain that causes the entire DAO to implode. And I think our perspective is, these microeconomies can be built with these 8 design principles woven into the fabric of the community and based on, rituals and tools that we use. Frameworks that we use is probably better than tools to create boundaries, to have robust conflict resolution, to have participatory decision-making, just to name 3 of these principles.
Nice. So I think actually that's a great spot. And if I repeat back a little bit of what you said, you want to use Elinor Ostrom's 8 principles from the institutional, from the IAD framework. I forget what the A stands for. Someone can hit me in the show notes or, get me on Twitter and be like, how dare you forget them? But could you maybe cover some of them for us real quick before I dig into my next set of questions? What are the 8 principles of the the IAD framework?
Well, so the book that she wrote, the Governing the Commons, really goes through this, and as well as each of the commons that she studied and derived this research from. So clear boundaries, like who can and can't use the commons, this participatory decision-making, or like the rules have to govern the local needs. So the people who are participating in this commons should be the people making decisions. Decisions shouldn't come externally. That the people that are affected by the rules can participate, can change the rules.
Oh, and there was an interesting one I remember too. There was that the commons must have a legal status, legal recognition in the jurisdictions they operate. Yeah, something like that. And not to make you, I don't want to put you on the spot for all 8, right? Okay. We do have them as well. We can also
I'll just throw
remind the audience.
2 more, like graduated sanctions and mutual monitoring. The ability to see that there's, I think the official scientific term that she used was like suckers, that nobody wants to be a sucker. So there's being able to see that the rules are being well respected. And if they're not, that there's a way to imply graduated sanctions against those that are.
Great. That's awesome. So that's a great spot to dig into, right? Because you have a lot of folks who come in and say, hey, we want to decentralize our community. We're not for, managerial hierarchies and this, that, and the other. But at the same time, you look at state and markets, well, not necessarily markets, states and corporations who are the major organizers of a lot of market activity, and they're organized in these ways. And if we were to not do that, we have to replace that with something, right? So you mentioned conflict management, you mentioned rules being enforced, sanctions, all of that. Can you give us a quick little background into how does a common stack think about applying these things, maybe specifically to things like conflict management, right? How is a DAO if they say, we don't want to participate in these other forms of, what's the term here, of enforce? You mentioned sanctions, you mentioned, centralized court systems, these other things. What are the conflict management methods that you folks have come along with that have developed as a result of being influenced by Ostrom's principles?
Oh, I love this question. And this really touches at the heart of what we call the cultural build of the commons, right? We have the technological stack and we have a cultural stack. And those are the stacks, the commons stacks. So I would say each of these principles have corresponding either rituals in the culture that we've built. Let me just pause for one moment and say that up until the first field test of a commons with a capital C, this was very theoretical. This is probably how it could work. And the token engineering community was the first community to decide to use our cultural and technical build to create a commons with a capital C. So now the token engineering commons is the first commons. So when I speak about this, I'm going to speak about how we've seen it apply in a real environment of real humans cooperating for a shared mission, which is in this case to advance token engineering. a nascent new form of engineering. And so for conflict resolution, there's a few things. There's the part of the culture where we are just inclusive, right? So people are welcomed into meetings. People are, we sort of create an environment where there's a lot of, I guess, respect and opportunity for people. So that's sort of like a little bit of the focus on how people feel when they come into the TEC. And then there is actually a working group that we call Gravity that's dedicated to conflict management. And the purpose of Gravity is twofold. One is to deal with conflict when it arises. So if there's a conflict from 2 people, 3 people, however many people, there are trained mediators that will mediate a conflict between people in the DAO, in the commons. So there's a way to just submit a type form that says, I really felt bad when this person did this thing in this call. And then somebody will come and speak with both people, bring them together in a joined meeting, and see this case through to the end. So that's the immediate, you can, if you have something, you have a place to drop it. If you feel that you've been wronged in the community, you have a place to bring it. So that's important. Secondfold, they do training courses. There's a new training course that I think will start in about a month or 2 months. This year, there's a new training for gravitons. It's in nonviolent communication, liberating structures, mediation. So giving the community the tools to then have these tools ourselves as we're operating in our own community, and creating environments that are less susceptible to conflict. So I'd say that's how we handle that. One of the other interesting working groups that we have is called Transparency. And this is more related to the mutual monitoring principle. So everything that we do is really very transparent, like shockingly transparent. Every working group meeting has been recorded for almost close to 2 years now, and they're all available on YouTube. They're all public.
Oh yeah, I've seen these.
It's a digital gold mine for, researchers in the future. All our meetings are open. All of our documents are open. And there's the transparency group created an audit to surface the transparency principles and practices that create high transparency environments versus low, and audits each of the working groups to see where they fall on that gradient.
Got it. And so if you contrast this with the standard sort of conflict management, right? If you don't do your job in a corporation, there's a performance improvement plan, there's HR, and then they get you out of there, right? So, or on the, we're only talking about one thing here. This is relative to your work performance. But if we talk about other things like harassment and what have you, at the end of the day, from my perspective, Martin, feel free to chime in, but this is my somewhat, I call it a realist one. For the most part, when you look at corporate conflict management, job one for most of the time is to protect the corporation, right? For the folks who are running this, right? That's what HR's job is. That's what, all these other forms of conflict management are. It's protect the corporation. And so now shifting into this space, right? If we take an example around DAO conflict management, right? Where folks are, someone's not doing their job, right? Like they said they deliver something, they didn't do it. It's been 6 weeks of repeated, I wouldn't say a DAO manager necessarily, but there's a working group potentially. That working group has signed on to delivering a particular piece of functionality or maybe a new program, and someone in the group isn't delivering. In these new sort of commoning circumstances that we're all kind of working to build on together, how would that work with these types of patterns? What are the tools we have that y'all and maybe other folks are developing that maybe it's not within only Common Stack. Maybe there's other things you've seen with the way that these digital communities manage conflict.
Yeah. And just a follow-up on that's kind of similar. I mean, I've never worked in a company that's larger than 500 people. And so I don't really know what it's like to work in a corporation. And so I guess when I hear some of this stuff, I think, well, this just sounds like the stuff that happens in normal startups, right? I mean, you have a problem, you address it, you have a fairly open culture. And so, I mean, I guess if you're working in a large corporation, this stuff isn't happening. Or if you're working in a toxic startup, this stuff isn't happening. And so I guess what I'm trying to tease out literally trying to tease this out in designing, taking a Web 2 company to Web 3, as I think about the DAO, how is this different from, say, what Ray Dalio has done with principles, where you can't gossip about another employee. Everything has to be transparent in the communication. And so I think it'd be helpful to understand, are we just talking about dysfunctional firms here, and we're trying to avoid dysfunctional firms and put in place a set of practices or a set of tools that build culture so that we don't have kind of dysfunctional firms? Or within DAOs, are there design patterns that are actually fundamentally different than how a firm is structured?
Okay, there's a lot there. Where do I start? Okay, so
wherever you like.
Yeah, I love Ray Dalio Principles. I think it's one of the most extraordinary books. I just think he's contributed so many. I mean, like their transparency was like the mother of all transparencies. So what he's been able to, he's a very unconventional thinker, and I think that he applied that in Bridgewater.
Yeah.
Okay, so human conflict. So I think when humans get together, we create conflict. Let's just say is that first principle. It's unavoidable. And it is cultural differences, personal differences, communication differences. Let's just forget about why and just assume that humans in any meaningful group will have some conflict. And so in my mind, I'm like, do I have any conflict in my previous organizations? I guess in previous organizations, when I have seen conflict, I myself acted as the mediator to try to address it. Like if there's conflict on my team, I will be that mediator. I'll be like, okay, what's going on? And so there's this, I'd say, responsibility of managers to try to resolve conflict within their own teams. And if there's I guess you keep going up, right? Until you have, I don't know that I've ever been involved in a situation where HR needed to be involved. Nothing's coming to mind, but I would imagine that, the human resource team is equipped to try to reduce the energy suck that conflict causes in an organization. It's emotionally consuming. It creates inefficiencies in work streams. Like it's not helpful, but transforming that conflict into understanding each other, I think is what the Gravity Working Group tries to help to do. I kind of want to go back a little bit to this idea of like performance as a failing point. So, and there I would go back to this mutual monitoring and accountability.
Great.
But the accountability is self-imposed accountability. So I mentioned the sort of transparency group as a working group dedicated to keeping transparent operations. But the stewards working group, and I'm the stewards, I and Nate, my co-steward Nate, are the stewards of the stewards working group, also have, we use the Scrum framework because accountability is sort of built into the Scrum framework. Right, we have sprint planning sessions. We're a 2-week cadence. We have a sprint board that's open and public to everybody, not just our own working group, but anybody, anywhere can look at our sprint board. A newcomer to our community can see what we're working on, can jump into an issue and try to help along. And every 2 weeks, every steward or active community member says what they're working on. We add it to the sprint pipeline. And then at the end of 2 weeks, we look at what was done and what wasn't done. And it actually just becomes clear the performance, the people who aren't able to keep their commitments, right, just sort of becomes obvious. It's almost not necessary to then raise, a complaint and have a performance plan. It's just a matter of then assigning work to other people or in our sprint retrospective, spending an hour reflecting on what went well and the things that didn't go well and how we can improve. So constantly adapting to the dynamicism of like, okay, well, our priorities this 2 weeks were this, but these things changed. So the next 2 weeks, our priorities will be something else.
Got it. And then you touched on an interesting thing here. You just backed into it. So I'm going to continue going with it, this good stewardship, right? So I think that it's interesting how the terminology and jargon around DAOs has shifted. There aren't any, one of the big jokes you see, right, is like, who's the CEO of the DAO, right? Like that doesn't really make any sense, right? For the most part. Although I do know some DAOs where that would definitely make sense, right? They're just masquerading as corporations on chain. But I think what Martin is also getting at, right, is that like, have we just renamed these things, right? Are they really just kind of the same thing? And so I think maybe you could tell us a bit about, as a steward, what is a steward, first of all? And then maybe after that, you could tell us a bit about like, what is a good steward?
I love this question because this is my wheelhouse. I mean, so the definition that I've been using is stewardship is the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. And for me, this is the community. Like this is the mission and the community. And I come from a very traditional background, right? Like I'm very used to hierarchical structures. I'm very used to management chains. I'm very used to command and control. Like that's the environment that I started my professional career in. And so this complete 180 to decentralized autonomous organizations has been just so spiritually awakening for me, actually. And I think that when I imagine the better ways that we can do this, we can DAO. A lot of it is just pulling in the things that work really well in organizational structures, like the Scrum framework. It's actually quite fantastic, right? Like it is introspective, it's adaptive, it's transparent. Like the 3 pillars of Scrum are exactly what you need in a decentralized autonomous organization. And then there's things that we leave behind, right? Which is like somebody tells somebody else to do something, but we allow people to say what they want to do, right? This idea of like, it's a doocracy DAO, so that you can come and you can just take a piece of work. I see something that needs to be done, so I'm going to do it. One of the things that we're learning in the TEC, I would say, that's sort of come up in our cultural discussions is that it's very difficult for many people who are trained in being told what to do to know how to operate in an environment where you're expected to find what to do that's meaningful. Definitely. And so I would say like being able to facilitate, helping people understand they have agency is a big part of our cultural build. I'd say, in fact, that's probably the number one challenge, right? Like, how do you make sure people know that they have the agency to come and do something without being asked to do it, without asking to do it? And it's a tightrope, it's a tightrope rope. We're like tightrope walk. Is that the right phrasing? Yeah. So it's something that we're still working with. And then I'm going to just go back to this sort of leadership, and I want to go back to this idea of like DAOs have no leaders. I'm not buying it. There's some element of leadership. It's a different kind of leadership though. And I think that's the most important point. And in the talk that I did at ETH Denver, that's really the point I wanted to convey, that it's like, it's not, I could make this analogy with like Hardin's idea of a free-for-all. The tragedy of the commons was the tragedy of the free-for-all. It's the tragedy of structurelessness, the tyranny of structurelessness. It's sort of the same thing. It's like, it's not effective. There is some structure and there are some leaders, but it's the kind of leader that I've really zeroed in on a framework called servant leadership as like, wow, this resonates the most with how I see the stewardship in a commons. And it's these, very empathetic, aware, listening, healing. It's creating a fertile ground for new leaders to emerge rather than directing work. In fact, it's the opposite of directing work. It's allowing a ground where people self-direct, have the autonomy to direct themselves to be the most productive that they can be in the commons, in the community.
So I just want to touch on that point kind of quickly. So you bring up kind of this servant leadership, or Jim Collins and Good to Great kind of called it level 5 leadership, where he really talks about servant leadership. And if we go back to principles and Ray Dalio, one of the things that they put in place at Bridgewater is that you would have they're looking at markets, right? This is one of the biggest hedge funds in the world. And they're looking at different asset classes, and different people on the team have different perspective on different asset classes and have more or less knowledge. Right. Mm-hmm. And so when you're in a room and you're having a debate, some of those people actually have better capability because they've just have more experience in this particular area. And so when you're thinking about kind of a young person coming into a DAO without a lot of experience that wants to take on and proactively tackle this portion of work where there might be someone else in the DAO that's kind of more capable, how do you deal with that sort of tension and where does the kind of self-actualization get put into a construct where people actually just need training, right? They actually need to be not maybe part of a hierarchy, but part of a team where there are leaders. So that's kind of the first question. The second question is that even if we focus on servant leadership and emotional intelligence and the type of leaders that I think all of us want to work with and many of us want to be, there are going to be leaders that just have more capability than other innately, right? Through experience. I mean, you think about someone like Gandhi, you think about someone like, Mandela. Many of us will never be those leaders. So we're just never going to be able to achieve that sort of leadership. And so I'm just wondering, within a decentralized organization, where is there kind of this recognition that leadership is a capability that can be honed over time, but there may be kind of elements of innate leadership that some people just have that others, no matter how much they try, are not going to be able to achieve. And maybe that's my own kind of bias that I'm bringing to this.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's go. So for the first one around experienced versus inexperienced, so both of your points are very, very true. So let me try to share with you what I have observed based on my experiences here. And, and I guess if we want to do like a compare and contrast traditional Web3 organizational structures, the experienced versus inexperienced, it's sort of like learning ladders, right? Like, okay, you're going to go on this, you're going to do your trainings and you're going to have this sort of education. It's not so dissimilar in theory, right? Like the words that came to my mind was like apprenticeship and mentorship. And that exists in Web3 structures as well. Maybe not as structured as formal. Here in France, you're required to have like 40 hours of training every year, like whatever. There's some requirement for the number of hours of training that you have. So that's a very rigid, formal structure. I would say in DAOs, it's more like, where, say, one of the ways that I've learned leadership is by experiencing excellent leadership. So being next to, observing leaders lead. Like observing amazing leaders lead. And with this very transparent environment, we see that, you see great leaders lead. You see things that you adopt yourself. So it is a kind of training ground, right? With, I think, the right community and the right environment and the right culture that is the servant leadership who wants to grow, who wants other leaders to emerge. Leadership for me is enabling other leaders. It's less interesting for someone to just tell everyone what to do without objection. It's much more interesting to have the contrarians in our community. And we have lots of differing opinions. And I would say they would feel contentious in almost any other environment. But they somehow just feel respectfully contrarian in this environment. And I think that's a testament to the cultural build. And so for the experienced versus inexperienced, sometimes I've seen somebody less experienced take a shot at something and not be able to deliver it. And that can happen. And then somebody with more experience can do it again and execute. And that can happen. So because it's not command and control, because it's not, hey, you do this and here's some resource that'll help you if you can't execute it. It's sort of like, I'm going to try it. It didn't work. There's some acceptance of people will try things and not everything will work, but that's also part of this sovereignty, right? That we have this agency that we have to try things and not everything has to work. And I think that's, for me, a very different, we have to just accept that some things will fail. Whereas I think in traditional organizations, it's you can't fail. We're going to design it, we're going to plan it, we're going to execute it. If it fails, it means something went wrong. Whereas here, it's just it's an experiment, somehow there's more experimental mentality to try things. That's where I'm triangulating on that question. And then around this emotional intelligence and some people having more capability than others. Yeah. I think that there's very special people, very extraordinary people. And I think that not all of us can be extraordinary. So those of us that aren't have to just try our best to continuously improve. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I wish Gandhi would, yeah.
That Gandhi was part of your DAO.
Join our DAO.
Definitely checking in for ordinary person here. So yeah.
I guess, so one of the things that attracts me, and I think attracts many of us to Web3, is the concept that these organizations can build, they're inclusive and there's a lot of qualitative benefits to them, but there's also the perspective that they can build more inclusive wealth, right? They can build more inclusive kind of economies. And for a DAO to be competitive, there's kind of multiple dynamics going on. One is that you're sharing the economics and the governance more broadly, right? And theoretically, that should be like throwing a grenade into the cap table of a traditional Web2 organization, because people should feel more empowered. But one of the things that venture-backed companies do very well, and kind of high-growth startups do very well, is they are able to screen and attract really good talent, right? And what I'm trying to figure out here is, how does a DAO do that if you want to encourage kind of a culture where people can fail, but there's only so much failure that can happen if you're trying to achieve a goal, and you really need to put the right people into the right seats. This is, again, going back to Jim Collins. He's like, get the right people on the bus, get the wrong people off the bus, put the right people into the right seats. And I'm just wondering, operationally, when you have this consensus framework, how do you do that in a way without a command and control structure at the speed with which is necessary in order to compete in this highly competitive world that we've created?
You don't.
I thought you would say that, but I'm interested in hearing more.
Yeah. Speed. I mean, that's where I think you don't. I think things just take more time. Collaboration, not necessarily full consensus, but even building consensus building is successful based on how much time and effort is put into it. So I would say I see, but I don't want to say that means it's lesser than, traditional organizations. I think if you want to have a very small, select, exclusive team achieve a mission in a short amount of time, you need a hierarchical structure. That's the way to do that. But if you want something else, then I think that there's other structures available for larger communities to collaborate on achieving a mission together, and to have, the economic upside of being successful in that endeavor. So my gut instinct here is that we're comparing two different things and then two different styles of operating. And I think attracting people is really important, actually. I would say attracting the right people is really important. And that comes down to having I'm going to take this example. I'm not going to speak about every DAO, because I think every DAO is very different from each other. We have some similar things, but I would say this Commons DAO is like very unique to this particular culture and a particular mission. The mission is public goods. We're not necessarily going to attract people who are like, hey, did number go up? But more like, hey, are we achieving something better for humanity by creating ethical, safe token engineering tools and standards for this new Web3 that we're building together? So the kinds of people that kind of community will attract are very different than, the communities that want to, 100x NFTs, or like be part of the Bored Ape Yacht Club. Like, they're just different. They attract different kinds of skill sets and, core values. So I would say, or maybe, some people are in both, who knows? But I would say to attract people, I think that the mission and the probability of success sort of have to be there, right? Like, I like this mission and it looks like it's going to work. Like, so I'm going to put some effort into that. And my own experience and observations with the Token Engineering Commons, we've attracted really, I'd say, visionaries in token engineering, the founders of token engineering, who have been really, I would say, who've backed the Token Engineering Commons from the beginning. And then new people who are beginning their journey in Web3 and see this as the next right move for how we can create a different version of Web3 than we did with the previous web versions. So I think people who want to see a more just and equal access to value, and a more focus on how we can create value out of public goods. Like, imagine if you could invest in a public good and get a better return than on your Facebook stock. Like, how would that change the world? How would investing in public goods, being profitable, change the ecological surface of our world right now, or the cultural or the generational? And this goes back to, there's a really influential book. Eleanor Ostrom, I think, is extraordinary. I mean, she's single-handedly changed this perception of human cooperation. And then some people who followed her, David Bollier, Silke Helfrich, I think her name is, who David Bollier's book, Think Like a Commoner, was one of the more exceptional books for me about commons that are existing in ways that we haven't recognized them as commons. He gives an example of surfers in Hawaii. So the formula essentially is it's a resource, so something of value, and a community that actively uses that resource, and then a set of protocols for how they can interact, like how they can use it, who gets what when. And he uses as an example these surfers in Hawaii who know that they know who gets the next wave. They just there's a set of protocols that they've all internalized, and there's some friction when people come from external to participate in this resource, which are these amazing waves, and they don't follow the set of protocols that this community have sort of developed around these who gets the next wave, in what order, and how many times you get to do it.
Yeah, so I get, and I really agree with everything that you're saying. I guess where I'm trying to get to here with this line of questioning is and maybe my construct on this is wrong, right? So let me kind of voice my assumptions. My assumptions are for Web3, so these ideas are not new, right? And so you had Jerome Lanier talking about this stuff and who owns the future, right? And so some of the Web2 folks essentially were thinking through how did this get so messed up, right? Before blockchain came around. And on the heterodox side of economics, you have the people like Ha-Joon Chang who are thinking about this from kind of the economics perspective as well, not just in kind of the commenting space, but also there's a whole kind of line of economic thought that doesn't go down the neoliberal tradition that is tied very closely to some of the stuff we're talking about. But my assumption is that for this to become mainstream, it has to compete, right? And my question, and why I'm asking about talent, why I'm asking about HR, why we're asking about kind of conflict resolution is, in your view, does the evolution of Web3 and the technology that we're talking about here, both the engineering technology and the cultural technology, become dominant and mainstream? Or are we moving to a world where we have kind of what cooperatives have been in the past, which is they're not a dominant economic modality. They're a very important way of organizing and sharing broad-based ownership and wealth. But we've kind of been constrained by the capitalism that I think all of us are kind of tired of today. And if we are moving towards that with Web3 becoming dominant, don't we have to learn about all of the ways what are the best practices that we should be taking from kind of the traditional firm structures, or should we be throwing some of that out? And maybe that question is a little bit too broad to answer. So maybe just sticking on kind of the first question around, can Web3 become the dominant economic modality?
I don't know that I have the answer, and I don't know that anyone you ask will have the answer to that. Let's say the Web3 DAOs as organizations that steward funding for objectives of a community that are token holders of that DAO is a new form of organization. And we'll see where it goes for sure. Will it be the dominant one? I'm not so sure. I don't think it replaces all traditional corporations. I don't think it replaces all government entities. I think that there's some harmony I think that they live together, they coexist. And I think that there will be perhaps humans will decide which organizational structures they choose to participate and belong to and invest in. And humans will decide which ones move forward. If I go, and this is where I feel like a lot of the experiences that I had going from this dial-up to now is will the internet be the dominant? Yeah, it's probably going to be, but we'll see how that shakes out. Newspapers and music companies are probably going down, but did we know we were going to do Airbnb and Uber? Maybe not in the late 90s, we didn't, So I think that, and I also think what we have now is we're not done. We've just started, we've just scratched the surface. At the Amsterdam conference, I was hanging out with Sam from Blossom Labs talking about, some of the problems with conviction voting that we're seeing. And he's already worked with, I think Zargham has worked on this, the concept of like osmotic funding, using superfluid and conviction voting to be able to have communities fund based on their interest. So to turn on and off their interest and how different working groups are working. So the most exciting thing for me here is that like we're building these things, we're building new cryptoeconomic primitives, we're building these new governance and funding tools and voting tools to be able to tweak things, to be able to change things. And I think that maybe that is the big advantage, is that we can change so much, whereas many corporate structures are a little bit stuck. They don't have as much adaptability and agility to change things in the way that just token holdings allows people to change things. Quadratic funding and quadratic voting was really interesting. That was a real big change for how we can use token holders, how we can dampen the influence between the smallest and the largest token holders. Yeah, so I'd say most interesting is, I don't know if it'll be the dominant form. I think that they'll exist. I think that we'll coexist. And I think that we continue to develop new things. It's like, this is especially like today is quite pertinent. Like, oh, we're in a bear market. Oh, thank God we can start building things, Like, this is going to be amazing 2 years of building. You're not going to believe what we're going to turn out.
So it sounds like, what I'm hearing from you kind of consistently is this is really about intentionality in kind of the work and less about kind of this, like the sense of teleological progress towards a particular goal. And that to me is, and I think like that really comes through when you talk to many people who are working in this space. It's really about the mission. It's about the impact. It's about kind of trying and tweaking and designing and responding to try to get to this place of of using technology and using kind of organizational structure to achieve more inclusive outcomes. And hopefully we'll get there, right? But maybe, this just becomes the way that the world used to be organized, which was in a bunch of different ways of a bunch of different kind of economic modalities. And we didn't have one dominant form that seems to be a virus that's taking over more and more countries.
Yeah. And I think like my answer to your question, Martin, is like, I also don't necessarily think it'll be a dominant form, right? But my hopes in areas like what Tamara and the groups at Common Stack, Block Science, those folks are working on, is that there are these little pockets of, you call them pockets of freedom, really, that pop up in places like complexity economics and information science, information processing, and organizational structure, right? And so like, I don't think we're anywhere near that type of stuff right now. Like when you look at the state of basically even having a DAO plan as objectives and then try to do those things, right? Like, there are some very productive ones, but I don't think you could put them on par with any of the corporate information hierarchies yet, right? Like they're definitely folks who ship, but those people, I don't think that they're going to be DAOs themselves, right? Like, well, the advantage of this that like we've been writing about at Prime DAO in particular, stuff like network cooperation, which that's a super old idea, right? It's like 70s Rand Corporation, it'll be in the show notes, right? But this notion of tribes, institutions, markets, and networks that came out like a long time ago. This is when the Rand Institution was looking forward out of the 80s and going like, what is going on and what does the next version of society look like, right? And like this TIMN like framework kind of came out of that. And that's kind of what I see as one of the forms that DAOs can take, right? It's not just that, like when you think about the firm, right? With like, the firm in the Coasian sense, right? It's just like, I'm going to absorb everything that lowers my transaction costs until there's no more efficiency to be wrung out of transaction costs. Whereas then you end up in this monolith where I actually think it's quite difficult to compute the prices of the things you're trying to offset as efficient, right? And so I feel like it's almost like an unbundling where you're coming into making networks of networks that do specific pieces of things for each other, right? And so I think you're starting to see this specifically in service DAOs, right? So like you'll have a DAO that has a token and only cares about who holds that token and what the objective of that DAO is. And then there might be a supply and demand side of that DAO, right? Where there's like on the supply side, you might have, think of it as supply, but basically a service DAO that comes in and says, hey, you want to go there? We can build the thing that gets you there, right? And we'll handle the building side of it, right? And we'll ship the product. You guys have to use it and you have to find users who will then use it, right? And it actually you end up kind of unbundling the corporation and really being clear about whose incentives are what, right? And so like when I think about this in relation to the corporate form now, I think you see this. I'll take a SaaS company as example, right? I promise I'll stop ranting about this. You just kind of got me going on this a little bit with your questions. Is that when you look at any product-led growth company that has a, actually, Tamara, you mentioned Typeform, right? There's dozens of these, right? There's Tally, there's Typeform, there's Airtable. There's all these companies that survive by capturing customers at really cheap cost, giving them a great product experience, and then getting them on their way to get other people in the thing. When you break those companies down, you look behind them, there's a group that's in charge of acquiring that customer using money on various platforms like Facebook and Google and all that. There's another group that's in charge of the onboarding metrics for that group for like, let's get them into the product. There's another group in charge of engagement, and there's dozens of others I'm leaving out, right? But basically, a lot of the times when you look across the groups, their incentives are at odds with each other, right? Like there's a guy who wants to get people as cheaply as possible. But the problem is that when he acquires a customer as cheap as possible, that person may not be the ideal customer. And the person upstream is like, but I don't want that person. I want someone else who's going to be a more ideal customer. Well, that person costs too much money for me to meet my metrics, right? So you end up in some of the best, I feel like we all kind of have selection bias here. We go, well, look at Facebook, look at all these thriving businesses that do this already. And it's like, there are 5 of them, right? There might be space for more of them if we have a breakdown of the incentives and the networks behind them, and we can actually find ways to align those, right? So that's still a super vague answer, but my hope really in this space is that that's even a possibility, because otherwise, why are we doing it? Right? We might as well just go back to working for a corporation and rolling these things up into a hierarchy with really clear information calculation and solving the information problem across groups.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think like on top of that, the composability of the technology, right? So we talk about quadratic funding, conviction voting. I've not heard of osmotic funding before, so I'm gonna have to check it out.
It's like a hackathon project.
Okay. So like all this stuff, like problem emerges, problem is solved like within days or weeks, right? Or new, maybe not solved, but new designs emerge. And that's kind of the power of the composability of this technology.
Yeah. And I'd say, because you mentioned Prime Down, Jahed, I also want to say, like, I think that what Prime DAO is doing is really important in this space, because this idea of DAOs, they're porous, their membranes are very porous, right? So things come in and out, people come in and out, organizations collaborate for a little while and then separate and do other collaborations. It's a very different paradigm than these like sort of agreements between these structural organizations that have contracts to deliver this, very transactional rules that are governing how companies work with each other. DAO to DAO collaboration is game changing, right? People can pull funding together, like the proposal inverter, to be able to fund new research and fund new projects that can help open source communities or like public goods and open source toolings and research and education. And to go back to this idea of like, will DAOs be the dominant modality? There's in my talk about beyond market and state, and I just want to say two things. So beyond market and state, it's not my title. It was a paper published by Eleanor Ostrom when she talks about polycentric governance. And then it was the title of a book by David Bollier and Silk Fritsch, which is a collection of essays. And for whatever reason, those 3 words cast a magical incantation for me. And it was like, what? We can go beyond. I felt like I didn't even consider that there was an alternative or that there was a different way to do something other than what we do with markets and states. And of course, it's so clear now. I talk a lot about living in a DAO. Living in Web3 is this two-way mirror thing, right? And on one side of the mirror, you see the real world, you see the world, like, oh yeah, that's where I used to live, but you're in this like, solar punk future. And then on the other side of the mirror, all you see is like the world, the Web2 world reflected back at you. And it's the sort of like, oh, that's the beyond that I like. This is the beyond that I keep, that these words mean to me. Like we have different ways we have a way to build things over. Do we step back from corporate personhood now? Probably not. Like we're too deep in it. Corporations are going to outspend, outlobby, outmaneuver individual natural persons. But now we have a chance to sort of build something different from the ground up, where maybe natural persons can be natural persons and not have to compete with corporate personhoods, right? So building something beyond our markets and states as they are today. And I'm not advocating for like the elimination of markets and states. It's just there's something else, and we've eliminated commons and we've enclosed these natural resources that should belong to everyone on the earth for profit seekers, and the markets, of course, the private markets have benefited tremendously, but so have the states. And we haven't, right? Our children haven't, our earth hasn't, our culture hasn't. So seeing that there's some other way that we can try to build things anew, and having this incredibly powerful toolkit in our hands to be able to experiment and build new things is what it makes me most excited about living in this solar punk Web3 world.
Awesome. Thank you for that rundown. I think like the one place we went all over the place, but I really like where we ended up. So I think the last thing I'd like to kind of maybe participate in with you here towards the end of this thing is, we've chatted with Jeff. I've chatted quite a lot with Michael Zarga on Block Science. He's probably going to be on within a month and a half or so. And the thing I'm really interested in, right, as I'm sure Martin is as well, is that I participate, just a couple things to get out of the way too. Like, I am a steward of Prime DAO, so thanks for sharing that out. But none of this is financial advice, just for anyone listening. And then the other thing is, of course, I participated in the Trusted Seed for Common Stack, I think 2 years ago, right? It was, or a year ago. I don't quite remember. But what I'm really interested in is the stuff that you've written around collaborative economies and all the things that are happening in this universe of, Giveth and TEC and all these folks who are working to make public goods come to life. What I'm principally interested in is we've dived deep quite a bit in public goods with Kevin, and Scott will be on the show, et cetera. I want to know what are some of the small scale experiments that folks like you and others are thinking of doing here, right? And I specifically mean not just Web3 stuff, right? Like, I think in particular, I think about some of my friends who work in mutual aid societies, who work in NGOs, who work in these things that depend on giving, right? On the giving and kind nature of others in order to sustain themselves. And I think, how can some of these patterns that folks like you are working on actually be enacted in the real world, right? Who's a good user group for this, right? Who, if you guys today if someone came in and announced a proposal in the token engineering commons or at Common Stack and said, folks, we need to find a real life use case for this beyond ourselves. And I'm not trying to insult you. I'm just saying, like, let's, going out there and putting it in the hands of people. What can a mutual aid society do with this? And then also, just to set the context a little, further for you, we have some friends at Open Collective, Pia Mancini and Alana Irving and a couple other folks there. They started that, 6 or 7 years ago with the idea of making mutual aid societies, open source groups, self-sustaining. And they have, they've developed some tools for that, just around fiscal and legal hosts. But I think about what you guys are doing. I think about the existence of Open Collective and real life folks who need to look at the public goods they're trying to steward, right? And say, how can I use this, right? Is there a way is that something y'all are thinking about, like top of your mind for that type of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're describing the Common Stack roadmap right now. So we launched a Common Stack prize to help another community. Basically, the prize is you would get Griff and Livia and myself and Ivy and some of the stewards from the TEC to, for free, work hand in hand with a community to deploy their own commons. And a commons, with this cultural build especially, right? Like, back to this, like, go fast, we go slow. Building a culture takes time and intention. And so it's a 9-month to 12-month, project for a community that will end up with an augmented bonding curve that is collateralized by some amount of the fundraise that this community does together. And the conviction voting, DAO voting, and this cultural build, these cultural practices around having these 8 design principles of commons woven into the fabric of the community by rituals and practices and working groups. And so the Commons Prize, we have 36 nominations so far, and the nomination period is closed, unfortunately. So anyone who hears this can no longer nominate a community, but we have, Precious Plastic Commons is one of the commons who applied for it. Kernel Commons, which could be really cool. Kernel is spinning off from Gitcoin, and they're looking at ways that they can actually create their own DAO. And the Kernel Commons is one of the ideas. Grassroots Economics, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they've applied for this prize as well, or nominated themselves for this prize to launch a commons to support the grassroots economics missions. Regenerative finance, like, imagine a regenerative finance commons where multiple different DAOs and regenerative finance can come together and fund research into regenerative finance, fund education, fund tools for regenerative finance that are created ethically and that are meant to help advance regenerative finance in a meaningful way. Other ones is like the open science or decentralized science commons. Mm-hmm. So there's some really cool ideas for commons, that can be on the ground. I'd say, so that's our roadmap is basically to do this, to help deploy another commons, to partner with the community to help deploy a commons, and then to open source all of the protocols for deployment so any community can then use it themselves. So there's a number of different phases, a number of modules in each phase. The protocols are pretty well lined out, and open sourcing these protocols to say, oh, you're a community and you want to do this collaborative economics deployment of a commons. Here's the manual for how to do it.
Very cool. And so I think like the grassroots economics one in particular, you said they applied. Is that one that is actually you guys are working on right now?
Well, so the prize works like this. There's a number of communities that are nominated, and then there will be a short list of finalists. The trusted seed is, so if you're a trusted seed, you vote. The trusted seed will vote for the finalists, and then there'll be one winner. And the winning community is the community that we're going to work with to help deploy the commons. And I'd say, there's another tool, I'm calling it a tool. It's like it's a culture. It's an element of culture is praise. And this is something interesting for other DAOs too. We've had so many DAOs come and ask us about how they can deploy praise in their own community. Praise is a way to distribute tokens to people who are creating value in your community to surface hidden work. So at the end of this call, I might praise, Jahed and Martin for spending an hour with me, having this great conversation and helping me see things from their perspective as well. And that praise would actually turn into tokens of the community. So it creates this culture of gratitude. It creates a way to reward with your governance token and your monetary token the people who are contributing value to that DAO. These are all these tools that like corporations just don't have. This traditional organizations just don't have these amazing incentives for creating value in a community and rewarding the value in a community. Reward system. We didn't even go into that. We could spend another half hour just on reward systems.
Well, I think that first of all,
we should in a future episode for sure.
Yeah, for sure. We'll have you back and we'll talk only about that because I'm fascinated now to be backed into this. I wish I had started with, you guys what real world projects are you guys doing? Because I really am interested to see what happens with grassroots economics with their, this community inclusion currencies. A lot of the stuff I feel, hits a roadblock because there aren't ways to easily scale this with a lot of repeatable patterns and composability like Martin was talking about. So it's very interesting to see what you could potentially do by building these local economies on the back of tested patterns that, I say tested because these ideas have been out there for a few years now. They've been put to the test by, Gitcoin in one instance, you folks in other instances. I know other folks have used augmented bonding curves. Bonding curves are in Balancer DAO, which a bunch of people use to launch their projects on. So they're tried and tested for fair launches and for making, a way to fund a project without it being gamed by fake people or gamed by people who just want to turn it into a money-making enterprise. So having this experiment now happen with real life NGOs and things like that is fascinating. So I feel like I'm going to just pencil in, talk to Tamara in 6 months and we'll see. We'll get an update from you on that front. And also, yes, please do praise me in the comment stack. I'm in there in the trusted seed. Thank you very much. Just to pump my own bags. And lastly, we're at right about time. So I think this is the time we like to turn it over to you and just say, in addition to everything else you've talked about, where can folks follow your work online and stay in touch with you? So
on Twitter, it's Tamarandom, something I chose, 2007 or something ridiculous like that.
Nice. Yeah,
it's haunting me now that you can't get rid of. So Tamara, and Tamarandom merged. Hop on the Token Engineering Commons Discord server. TAM2140, Common Stack Discord server. My DMs are always open. I love talking with people, especially people that are interested in the kinds of things I'm interested in. I'm pretty alone in France where I am. So I spend most of my time online talking with people that are interested in this too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll definitely have to have you back to talk more about kind of the operationalizing of all of this, and would love to go into rewards. And you also talked about some other stuff that we haven't gone into a whole lot of detail on the pod, augmented bonding curves. We need to get into that in more detail so people really understand it. Osmotic funding, once that's a little bit more worked through, would love to talk through it. And then some of the composable designs that you guys are building right now. So, and
there's a lot of better people than me to talk to you about reward system and the cultural build. Livia with Common Stack, Christopher is the product manager, of course, Griff, sort of like the conceiver. There's a lot of better people than me. So I'm happy to refer you to people that can also explain their vantage point as well.
Awesome. That would be great. We'll follow up with you for sure. And thanks a lot for your time, Tamara.
Yeah, such a pleasure. What fun.